Okay. All right, tell me if I'm too loud, too soft. Is that good? All right. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for crawling out of bed, even though you were here late last night, it sounds like. So our purpose here today is really to provide, I hope I'm going to provide some answers about how groundwater modeling works, and specifically how it can be used for your purposes in the Mohave Basin, and the Hualapai Basin, Mohave County. Toward the end, we'll get into more specific issues regarding this general area, but at first we're going to talk about some general hydrology. So let me just move on into the outline. First, we're going to just tackle the great big giant concept of groundwater modeling in a few slides. So we'll talk a little bit about groundwater hydrology. I don't know what people's background is. Hopefully it's somewhat familiar to you, but if it's not, I'm trying to bring everyone up to the same page here. Then we'll talk from there, we'll go into groundwater modeling with MODFLOW, which is a particular program. It's the most commonly used groundwater model in the world. Then we'll talk about Mohave County and modeling there, recent models, how we simulate recharge, and various modeling scenarios. And finally, we'll present some examples from other basins where we've worked that might give you some good ideas about how scenarios can be used to answer questions that you have. Joe and I have some additional sections to cover after I present my things, and that includes a section on combining objectives and constraints. So when you have a question to answer, you use the model. When you want to go into the planning and the design, then you have to work within the constraints of your system and try to meet the objectives, the sort of human objectives as well. And we'll talk about some current projects in the Kingman area, flood control and recharge modeling. And now we'll just get right on into groundwater modeling and start with a review of groundwater hydrology. And a lot of these slides, I hope some of them are familiar to you. You've probably seen them before in other presentations from USGS or reports that you've read. So I intentionally brought some familiar slides up so that we won't have to try to explain all the details if you're already familiar. But essentially, this is a little depiction of the hydrologic cycle in the desert. And this particular graphic is nice because it doesn't show an ocean. Most of the time when you look for a hydrologic cycle picture, it has a big ocean that's being drained into. And, a lot of our water never makes it to the ocean anymore, especially in the Colorado River system. But what's important, what was missing in this graphic was precip, which I thought was kind of interesting, because precip does actually happen even in the desert, and that's the only way we get input into the system. And I show it here happening over the mountains only. Of course, it does, as you know, rain in the basin sometimes. It may even snow a little bit, but most of the recharge happens from precipitation that falls on the mountains and either recharges right near the mountain base or runs off in ephemeral drainages into the basin. And now for some very basic definitions. What's groundwater? Groundwater is water below the ground surface. But what is it really? It could look like this. It can be a giant kind of underground lake, like a lot of people think, but we're not in Florida, so it actually looks more like this. It's really some sand and gravel and clays. It's just a bunch of sediment with a little tiny bit of water in between the pores, in the pore spaces between the sand grains. So when we talk about groundwater, we're not talking about a big lake here. There isn't such a thing in this part of the world. So an aquifer is just a water-bearing stratum of permeable rock, sand, or gravel. So there's a lot of different things under the ground surface. In some areas, if you put a well in, you're not going to get any water out. The formation's too tight with clay, for example. Even though there may be groundwater level there, if you let the well sit for a month or so, it may show water in it, but if you try to produce water from that well, nothing will come out. You have to pick an area where it's actually more permeable to build a productive well. All right, what's surface water? That seems obvious, everybody know. Water above ground. But there are some exceptions. There's lakes, there's rivers, and then there's springs. And this is an example of a spring in Florida, I believe, where it's actually groundwater. You're just getting a little peephole into the groundwater system through a sinkhole. So it's kind of like looking into a well. You can see that water. If you look down into a shallow well, you can see it with your eyes. But it's actually still groundwater. And this is actually still groundwater, too. It's just like a giant well that fell open naturally. So springs and rivers and lakes are often well connected to groundwater. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't in the desert. But we're going to be focused primarily today on systems that are connected to the groundwater. So let's talk about that connection. How are these systems related? This is a generalized cross-section of the hydrologic system in an area like where we sit here in the west, where there's precipitation in the mountains. That's kind of the recharge zone. Water infiltrates from the surface through an unsaturated zone. That means there's not a water table there. Eventually, some of that water makes it down into a deeper groundwater zone. And this is the part of the system called the aquifer. That water then gradually moves just by virtue of pressure. As more water moves in, old water has to move out. And that water moves to a discharge location. Often it's a stream or a river. There are some natural changes that can occur to groundwater systems. They happen slowly. Everything with groundwater happens really slowly until you get humans involved. And this is a key point. We really need to think about time scales. We act on a time scale that's completely different than nature, as you know, and especially when it comes to groundwater. Some of the groundwater we drink in Tucson is tens of thousands of years old. It's not going to readily replace itself in this current climate. And that's true of most of the state of Arizona and most of the Southwest. A lot of the water you're drinking isn't coming back. So it's important to think about that. But there are ways that natural systems change, and one of those ways is if you have I'm going to move away because I can't stand being tethered. You have a natural groundwater slope like this from a recharge area over here, and can you hear me? Is this recording? Okay. And the water is moving down gradient toward this discharge area in the stream. If you have a little recess here and water ponds here, maybe an ephemeral drainage slows down and makes some static water here, you can get some groundwater mounding associated with seasonal changes in surface runoff. So that's recharge. There are also natural discharge points. And one of those is through plants. So if you have some trees growing streamside here, they may be tapping into this very shallow groundwater and deforming the groundwater surface actually by pulling it out like a well. And that water then makes it into the atmosphere in the form of transpiration. Now when humans get active, as I said, things change quickly. Pumping wells have a very pronounced and rapid impact on a system. I'm going to go back for a second. This is a system under natural conditions where water moves in and out, and you see the flow lines are uninterrupted and all sort of moving down gradient to lower pressure, to a place where they can get to atmospheric pressure. Once a well is put in, here's the pumping well. Now suddenly, very rapidly, flow lines in the vicinity of the well are altered. So not everything is moving toward the stream anymore. Some of it is moving from the stream direction back toward the well. Everything around the well is coming radially into that well. So what happens now is there's a groundwater divide. And groundwater divide is a term that you'll hear a lot in different contexts, but what it means is that there are flow lines going in two different directions from that imaginary line through that divide. So some of the water is going back toward the well, some still going to the river. And that means this river that was a gaining stream, or still is a gaining stream, is now a less gaining stream. Okay, there's still water making it to the river. There's still recharge making it to the river, but some of that recharge is being intercepted by this new pumping stress. So that reduced groundwater to the stream is something we would call capture, and I'll talk about that more later. But it's an induced increase in, it's a source of increased discharge to the aquifer. So this water from the well, when it pumps, is getting water from aquifer storage, but it's also beginning to capture water from the river. So the pumping well is a new discharge area that didn't exist before. And after a long, long time of pumping, you kind of get into a new equilibrium where now there's no longer water making it to the stream at all, and basically the well is satisfying its demand partially by aquifer storage, whatever's coming in through the recharge, plus whatever it needs to bring from the river into the well to satisfy this pumping demand. So you can see this is a big alteration, a complete change in the pattern of base flow here. But now this is a losing stream. It's no longer even a slightly gaining stream. It's completely losing. So this has turned that river around now into something that's providing water to this groundwater well. And that would be a source of capture. So there are many sources of capture, but this is an important concept because really when you pump a well, you can only get water from aquifer storage, that's that water in the space between the grains, or from a source of capture, or both. It has to come from somewhere, and not always one source or the other. This is a graphic that may look familiar to you. Is in the Garner and Chuini publication about this area in 2011, USGS publication. And this is a schematic of how recharge works in this basin and range province here, this area. Basically, this is a watershed divide and a groundwater divide. See water going both directions. Recharge falls on the, precip falls on the surface. A little bit of it gets into the mountain rocks and recharges locally and springs out again as springs, comes out as springs. Some of it runs downhill and makes it all the way to the alluvial basin. Alluvium is just the ground up, eroded parts of old mountains that are now deposited in the center of the basin. And that's generally where a lot of groundwater is produced by wells. So some of it makes it into streams, which then lose water into the alluvium very quickly because it's more permeable. And that water kind of disappears into the system, the groundwater system, and then moves out toward the Colorado River. There is a hitch here, kind of an important one, that there's something between the surface where plants grow and access soil moisture and the groundwater system, and that's a big something called the vadose zone, or the unsaturated zone. So as I said earlier when we talked about how recharge makes it through the unsaturated zone to the water table, that takes a long time because sometimes it has to go through hundreds or even thousands of feet of unsaturated zone before it actually hits the water table. And whatever water is stuck in that unsaturated zone is inaccessible. It's unavailable for human use. It will eventually, gradually drain by gravity into the groundwater system, but just because you recharge water through the root zone, for example, doesn't mean you're going to be able to access that water again, unless you manage to overcome this unsaturated condition and wet up the whole thing, and then begin to get saturated flow, which is much more rapid. So importantly, if you start a recharge project, you need to account for the time it's going to take to wet up and build a mound up closer to the surface so that you can actively recharge and then expect to be able to access that water later in time if you want to. But it's not an immediate process. Okay, do we have any questions, basic hydrology questions up till now? Because I'm happy to talk more about anything, anytime. So, okay. All right, so modeling. MODFLOW modeling is, oh yeah.
So what's the term you used?
Vadose zone, yeah. Correct, and there's a whole separate science. There's a whole group of people that study just vadose zone processes because they're very complicated because you have air and water moving through the soil, the pore space. So sometimes gradients are upward, sometimes they're downward, but things can get locked into the vadose zone for a very, very long time. So MODFLOW is the bread and butter of groundwater modeling for the most part. Every groundwater modeler has used it. They may not use it today, but they have experience with it. So it's pretty much universal. It was one of the first numerical models created, and it was created by Harbaugh and McDonald, and they published their first report on it in 1988. So it's actually not ancient, at least to my standards, it's not ancient, but it's been around a long time as far as modeling goes. MODFLOW stands for a modular, three-dimensional, finite difference groundwater flow model. So a lot to chew on there. Modular means there are separate packages for various optional components. And there are a lot of packages in MODFLOW, but it was a kind of a new concept that you could take what you wanted and leave out what you didn't want for a groundwater model. So let's say you have you know, an ocean next to your aquifer. You may have a saltwater interface that you need to model with some kind of different process, an advective transport process. But in the desert, we don't need that, so we can leave that package out. There are some chemistry packages that you can add into MODFLOW, but in general, there are things like streams, rivers, springs, drains, and then boundaries, and we'll talk a lot more about those later on. Finite difference means that it's solving the equation, the groundwater flow equation, which we'll talk about a lot too, but it's assuming that each block, the model's built out of cells or blocks, and each block has constant properties across the whole block. There's not half a block that's got one connectivity and a different connectivity in the other half. The entire cell is made up of a constant set of conditions, parameters. So that's important, and that really is important when you talk about your grid size. So if you have a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid, that's just saying we assume that the entire 1 kilometer square area of that cell has constant and equal properties, which we know to be untrue, correct? I mean, life isn't like that. The world's not like that. But modeling is all about approximation and assumptions and time. So when you look at properties in the groundwater model over the kinds of time periods that we're talking about, generally months to years to decades, a lot of these little details that we're concerned about on the surface don't really matter. And that's a really key thing to understand when you start modeling, is what's important and what isn't to resolve. It's free. Yeah, it's a USGS product. It's Fortran, written in Fortran. Remember Fortran? Actually, they still use it for all the MODFLOW updates. There are generations of this model that have come out since then, many generations, and they're still all Fortran-based. I don't know if the latest one is still DOS-based, but certainly MODFLOW 2000, 2005, there were still, you know, executables that you download and ran in a DOS window if you don't have a groundwater, a graphic user interface, a GUI. So that's why most people have a third-party GUI that they buy from somewhere to make this thing manageable, because it's really incredibly complicated to get all the input together and put it into DOS. It's kind of crazy. That's what I did in grad school. But now there are ways to directly interface from ArcGIS or ArcView to take your GIS information and directly translate that into a groundwater model framework, which is extremely handy. So the groundwater flow equation is based on a couple things. Darcy's law is the primary thing, and don't worry if you don't remember that from like whatever, college physics. We'll go through it. And it's solved by stepwise iteration until some closure criterion that you as the modeler specify. So I say, I want you to keep solving this equation, keep solving until we have a mass balance within 1% for the total model, or until there's no head change greater than 0.5 meters, or whatever your criterion is. That's what it solves for. And it keeps solving, keeps iterating back and forth until it finds the right distribution of heads, or if you're calibrating the right distribution of conductivity, restorativity, or whatever parameter you're trying to solve for. Okay, so let's step back to the mid-1800s. Darcy, I think, was some kind of water engineer in France. And King Hubbert, M. King Hubbert, in 1957, took it upon himself to translate Darcy's grand experiment, from which all groundwater equations spring. But it's very, very simple, and it's really kind of cool to see it in action. This is his original drawing. Let's see if I can figure it out. He just set up a tube. It was a steel tube, and it had sand packed into it, and an inlet pipe here with a little valve on it, little turn valve that he could control the volumetric rate in. He put a manometer here, so this is just a little tube that accesses the pressure in that part of the big tube, and water will rise to reflect the pressure at that point. It'll rise up in this outer tube, so you can read the pressure. And he had another one of those down at the bottom, so he could read the pressure here. And then he had a spigot, and so he could measure the flow out. He knew the flow in, and then it was a matter of seeing how these two things related and how the two pressures related. And so eventually he defined these terms, the inflow rate, Q in, outflow Q out. Pressure at the top was defined by something called head, which is a combination of water pressure and gravity, and same thing at the bottom. And then hydraulic conductivity, this was a property of the sand that he put into the tube, and that really is just a proportionality coefficient for his purposes. He didn't really go to great lengths to define conductivity. It's just a coefficient. But hydraulic gradient then is defined like this. It's the head here minus the head here divided by the length of the tube. Pretty simple stuff. And so Darcy ran a bunch of these experiments, and it says here, the experiments comprise several series of observations made between October 29th and November, that's not important, but 1855, and some additional experiments made during February 1856. For each series, the system was charged with a different sand and completely filled with water. So he was astute enough to realize that not all sand is created equal, and that it might have some impact on how the inflow and outflow in the system relate to each other. And here's some of his results. For each sand, he got a curve like this. So this is, I can't read it from here. Gauge across sand. Okay, so I'm sorry, I can't read those x-axis. It's discharges on the left, right? And drop and head across the bottom. Okay, so he's looking at delta H here and a Q here, and he found that there's just this really constant linear relationship across all different heads. So he could have a really tall tube or really high pressure at the top, and it didn't matter what the difference in head was for a given sand, K1, K2. All the differences in head versus discharge fell along a constant linear line, linear slope. So that was a pretty good revelation. He basically discovered that there's a linear relationship between discharge and gradient. And area is just the cross-sectional area of the flow. Turns out that relationship holds no matter how the flow direction is altered in space. So you can have flow going down at an angle, you could have it going up toward the ceiling. It doesn't matter as long as pressure at the front end is higher than pressure at the lower end. And you can see that reflected in these two manometer readings here. You still get this great linear relationship. And what that says is water doesn't always flow downhill in groundwater systems. So that's one little piece of wisdom you can keep with you when people say water flows downhill. It does on the surface, but not in groundwater sometimes. And this is what it looks like if you kind of dissect a real aquifer. You might have on the surface, you got some plants here and a confining bed, which means maybe thick clays, on top of a producing confined aquifer. Confined means that it's under pressure. All the sediment on top of it is kind of pressurizing it. So if you put a manometer in here, if you take a little slice of it, put a manometer into it, you see that water levels rise up above the elevation of that particular little slice because they're under pressure. And then as flow moves out, you see that there's a relief in pressure. So the pressure on the left is greater than the pressure on the right because water is flowing out at a rate of Q times A. Or Q divided by A. Does that make sense? And so here's the water flowing through the pore space. It's just showing you how this experiment relates to the real world. Oops, wrong way. I don't know what I'm doing here. Okay. So again, the bottom line for Darcy was this proportionality constant. Trying to back up. This is another way to write Darcy's law. You'll often see it with a negative sign here, meaning it's just the difference in the way you organize the head differences. So if the bottom head comes first, the low head minus the high head, then you have a negative sign in front. So you often see it with a negative sign. And you may see a little q here, which is simply a quotient of the volumetric discharge divided by that surface area that the water is flowing through. So they're just different, different versions of the same thing. So this is the primary equation that MODFLOW solves, but it's combined with the groundwater flow, which is obviously affected by stresses like pumping, and that pumping has to either come from aquifer storage or capture from a boundary, which we talked about earlier. So if you write those two equations together, you see Darcy's law here, and you see a storativity term here. You have to assume continuity, so in equals out. Pumping is induced through porous media on the left, and on the right, that storage term represents the aquifer properties that release water when the aquifer is pumped. So there's a certain quality to the way the aquifer works, and that's reflected in this term storativity, and it's about how much water can be released per head of foot of drop in the aquifer. So that's the fundamental equation. And then how do you solve this? Well, it's done with a lovely second order partial differential equation, which I'm sure you're all ready for right now. It's really, it's uglier than it looks, but if you have a vector, a 3D vector going out in space somewhere, you have to describe it on 3 axes, right? X, Y, and Z. So we have to solve that groundwater flow equation in 3 directions, X, Y, and Z. And you're differentiating across head and conductivity. So head varies in 3 directions, and conductivity can also vary in 3 directions. So sometimes, often, in an aquifer, you have something called anisotropy, big word, but it just means that it's easier for groundwater to flow in one direction than another. And often, it's easier for groundwater to flow horizontally than it is vertically. Because why? Why? Because sediments are laid down in a more or less horizontal way. So there's kind of a natural tendency for groundwater to flow in one direction. But many things can change that, and not all groundwater flows horizontally. So if you want to try to accommodate all different areas of the aquifer, you have to model 3D flow with this equation. So you see, this may look familiar if you've studied heat transfer or electrical engineering, Laplace's equation. This is just the flow component here, and then the storage loss with change in head over here. Sorry that doesn't show up too well on the white screen, but hopefully you can see it. Right, so this is an analytical equation. MODFLOW is not an analytical model. It's a numerical model, so there has to be an approximation to this solution. And so basically, why do we need a model to solve that equation? Because there's a bazillion little parts of the aquifer that we are too slow to be able to solve in our lifetimes if we didn't have it automated. So we have inputs like pumping, stream diversions, evaporative demands. We plug in the equations to MODFLOW. It manipulates evaporation, stream flow, and an aquifer storage, and spits out something convenient for us, which is groundwater conditions at a point in time. as well as base flow and ET and other things that we want to look at some time into the future or even in the past to understand the system better. So the groundwater modeling process looks like this, and it's very hard for you to read, so I'm just going to step over here so I can read it. And I'm kind of starting to talk about where you guys are in your modeling adventure in Mohave County. Essentially, the first 3 boxes here are kind of complete for you. Defining the problem. Defining the problem means characterizing the geology, the hydrogeology of the system, so literature review, preliminary analysis, data collection, developing a conceptual model. This has all been done by the USGS since about 2000, I don't know when they started, but 11 and 13 and I don't know, but in the last decade. They have done a lot of research, background research for the purpose of developing a model. And so finally, developing a mathematical model, well, that's already been done. MODFLOW exists, so they didn't have to develop that on their own. They do have to put the model together. They have to design the area-specific model for MODFLOW to use, to work with it. It's the framework in which MODFLOW works to solve the equations. So that part they had to do. Right now, you're in the process of getting a new model design, and the calibration part of that is ongoing, as far as I know, with James Macy and Jake Knight at USGS. And so what they're doing is looking at historical water levels, so history matching, whatever water levels existed from old wells, not many. I think they had like 16 to match for the steady state model, so not much. A sensitivity analysis, and this means with MODFLOW, it's kind of like a machine where you can dial one knob at a time and see how that affects the input and output. It's kind of like you step on the accelerator in your car and you watch the needle move, or you put on the brakes and you watch it move the other way, or maybe you have some other alteration. And you can just, you do something to the system and you watch it reflected in the output. And you keep doing that over and over again, and you adjust the parameters. So let's say you've got a region of conductivity that you don't really understand. You don't know how the conductivity in this basin works. Is it really high? Is it really low? You think it's something like the next basin over, but maybe it's not. Anyway, the calibration process is all about trying to come up with a conductivity distribution for the whole model area. So areas of the alluvium have one kind of conductivity, areas of the mountains have another kind. But you want to devise some explanation for how water moves through the system in a way that makes sense and that matches historical observations. And the problem with modeling and calibration is there's no unique solution. You give it to 100 hydrologists, you're going to get 100 different answers. But they generally will converge on similarities, a lot of similarities. So there's no one right answer, which is highly convenient if you're a hydrologist. But it means that calibration is an art, and that some people are better at it than others, and it can be very tedious. Okay, once that model is working and you have the tool at your disposal, then you can start designing some scenarios. And this assumes one important thing, that you have a problem, a defined problem that you want to solve. It's not typical to run a groundwater model and go through all that expense and trouble if you don't have a problem to solve. It's not just for kicks. It's really expensive and an arduous process to develop a working model. Sometimes, a lot of times, utilities will build a model so that they can track the effects of their ongoing pumping and determine when it's time to shut down pumping in one area to prevent subsidence, perhaps. And then plan what's going to happen when they turn on pumps in another area when new growth happens over there. So it's mostly a planning tool for new stresses. And I understand that you are expecting some new stresses in this basin, so that's kind of what drives this process. But you have to have a specific problem and a specific question that you want answered in order to make use of the model. So very important. Once you have the scenarios designed, you have all your questions out there, then you run the model, and you get some results, and these results then can be applied to your projects, whatever projects you want to use to solve that problem that you started with. A lot of times when you start down that planning process, it leads to more questions, and you end up doing more scenarios and then some different project planning. So there's a bit of iteration in this back end, which is really where you want to be. You have a tool, very powerful tool. You want to use it a lot, if possible. I mean, you want to use it as much as you need to use it. So don't be afraid of this. I mean, these results here are not necessarily the end of the story. If you find out that where you're heading with the problem you thought you had and the answer, the way you thought you were going to answer that problem isn't working out, don't be afraid to shift gears and say, okay, we've learned something. We're actually going to try a different approach and see if that's any better. So it's a very, very powerful tool that should be used without hesitation and without limitation. Okay. Should we stretch for a minute? Are you guys like falling asleep? I think this is a good moment to just take a breather for a second. I'm going to get a sip of water. All right, well, welcome to the new folks in the room, and hopefully, if you have any questions that pop up, just interrupt me, because we may have covered it or we may not have, but I'm happy to pause and go back if we need to in any way. So now I'm going to focus on this big process of going from what we understand about the natural world, the natural system, and actually getting that into some kind of model format. How do you do that, and what does that look like? These graphics are also from the USGS report on the preliminary model for this basin, and this describes kind of the general geologic features in this area, not just in the Hualapai Basin, but the neighboring basins. So it basically goes like this. Initially, there were some extension faults going on, the basin range expansion, which caused blocks to kind of drop down, and so this side dropped down, this side moved up, this side dropped down relative to this side. Anyway, it's basically stretching apart. The basin opens up, mountains here get eroded a bit, and alluvial deposits form in the middle of the basin. And you can see right here, this little blob is an area of alluvium that was probably an ancient lake or maybe an ancient sea, and it is very low permeability relative to the stuff around it, which is more coarse-grained. So if you were going to drill a well, if I were going to drill a well, I would aim for outside this blob and not directly in it. And then over time, you can see the mountains get shaved off even more. They're very small now compared to how they were initially. And there's more recent deposits on top of these older alluvium deposits. So this is the younger alluvium, older alluvium, and basement rocks. And those are terms you'll hear a lot. Basement rocks. Basically, for hydrogeologists, a lot of times basement means that's the bottom of the world. We don't care anything about that. Sometimes there is still water in this basement area if it's very highly fractured. Sometimes not economical to go that far with a well because you drill way, way down, it's difficult drilling, and then you only get what's stored in the fractures, and that may not be very much. So it's most often, people will try to stick with the alluvium as long as possible. And once you tap that out, then you may have to start going deeper. We saw this before. So basically, from this concept, we go into this kind of really simplified concept of how the recharge works in this geologic context. All right, so this is a graphic directly from the old 1988 McDonald and Harbaugh modeling report for the original MODFLOW. And it's easy to see here that this is a layer cake structure with different characteristics of each layer that represents different hydrologic conductivities, storativity, porosity, characteristics of the aquifer materials. What you see on the surface is the surface expression of each one of these three-dimensional cells on the top layer. And each one of them has a node, which is the center point of each cell. And the black cells, the ones with black nodes are active, and the ones with hollow circles there are inactive. So not all cells in the model are always going to be activated during the process, but they all have to exist in order for MODFLOW to solve the equations. That's just the way it's structured here. Now, there are newer versions of MODFLOW where layers can actually pinch out and be discontinuous, but I'm talking about the standard MODFLOW that is up to MODFLOW 2005 at least, still in play and still the one that's being used for your project. So continuous layers, each cell here has a single homogeneous characteristic. So there's no distinction between properties across one cell, it's all one. And likewise, anytime you do something to a cell in MODFLOW, it applies to the whole cell. You don't just get to inject a well halfway down. In most cases, you have to inject across the entire thickness of that cell if you do an injection well. Or if you pump, your well may be screened only in the lower 100 feet, but in practice, it's basically applied to the entire thickness of the cell. And so MODFLOW, as I said, it's an approximation, a linear approximate, or numerical approximation to the second-order groundwater flow equation, second-order differential equation, and it's solved like this, basically from center to center of each cell. That's the L, the gradient, and then the Q is the flow from one cell to another. And this is done for every single cell and all 6 of its neighbors. So that's a lot of solving, a lot of solutions to compute over and over and over. I mean, you might have literally hundreds of thousands of model cells. So it can take a little while to run. Joe and I were asking me, how long, how complicated is it to run a model? It depends on what you're doing with these models, but I think for my purposes, I don't like to run something that takes more than 10 minutes. If it's something that I'm iterating and have to make changes to a lot. But in the process of calibrating, backwards solving for parameters, you may take hours and hours. I mean, it can be a very long process. And if it's a very complex model, it could still take hours, even in the forward direction. All right. Here's an example of something called a deformed grid. So here's the conceptual geology, and here's how it's translated into discrete model cells. And you can see here there's a pinching out of these layers. So this is a slight modification to the traditional MODFLOW setup. So you can have uniform or deformed or unstructured grids. There are a lot of alternatives now. It used to be only a structured uniform grid was allowed, but now there are many different ways to do grids. Grid size can vary. You can have it vary in 2 or 3 dimensions. You could have square cells on top, or you could have rectangular cells on top, and then a very deep cell. So anyway, they can vary. Hydraulic properties are generally specified as conductivity, storativity, porosity. Yeah. And of course, these models can be done in 1D, 2D, or 3D. It's flexible that way. Here's some examples of some of the newer grid options. This is kind of a traditional grid on an axis, an XY axis, with some refinement. So somebody said this part of the grid is very interesting. There may be a stream here, something going on that we need higher resolution grid, a smaller grid spacing in these areas. But the problem with this traditional grid is that grid refinement propagates out to the very edges of the model. You can't do it, well, you can now, but until recently you couldn't do it in just the area of interest. You had to have those grid cell spacings go all the way to the edges, and sometimes in the edge of the basin things would get a little crazy and the model wouldn't converge because the spacing's too small. So then they came up with unstructured grids, and this is basically a subdivision upon a subdivision upon a subdivision of an existing cell. And there's a special solution technique for that. This is a completely different kind of grid, but still unstructured, not squares, and radiating out. So yeah, there's different ways of solving the problem without requiring square grids or flat-faced grids. And this is a local model inside, basically a child model inside a parent model. None of these really apply to you, except maybe this one. I don't know if they're going to apply any refinement to any parts of the grid, but as far as I know, your model that USGS is building right now is a uniform, at least on the surface. The 2D surface is fairly uniform. Okay, there's a couple of really, really important things about modeling that you have to understand, and it's not just MODFLOW, it's about all modeling. So we're going to talk in some general terms here. Initial conditions. We know that it's just logical, right, that if you're going to start a process, you start from somewhere. And that's what initial conditions are about. MODFLOW doesn't know how to solve something unless it has a starting point. So you have to specify that when you model. In general, we try to specify something analogous to pre-development in the heads across the model. Head is just, in this example, water level. So we might specify, we know maybe there's something here that we know water level here, we know the stream elevation here, we know that water's moving this direction, so we can say, basically, this is our initial head, this is our ending head, and we're going to interpolate heads linearly across that just as a start, just as an approximation to start the modeling process. The model will then solve the equations that we talked about with considering recharge and natural discharge and come up with maybe something like this, a more natural looking distribution of heads across the water table. So the starting point doesn't have to be realistic, but it has to be something kind of close to where you're going so that the model doesn't take forever to converge. Boundary conditions. This is probably the most important and also the least uniform thing that modelers do. Everybody has their own preference for how to set up boundary conditions. And a lot of times this can really make or break a model and people don't realize it. Because as I said earlier, there's no unique solution. So if you don't get this right, you could come up with a distribution of parameters inside your model area that make absolutely no sense, but produce historically matched heads. And that's dangerous because what you do then from moving forward in the future, if you don't have something sensible going on in that basin, even though you've matched history, you're not going to match the future at all. And that's actually very common in modeling, unfortunately. There's not a lot of fact-checking into the future. We have to wait a decade or 2 or 3 to do any kind of validation. So it's pretty simple to say, here's your model, go ahead, run forward, but you won't know if those results are very meaningful for quite some time. So it's important to get the boundary conditions right. Really, really important. So we'll talk about this for a second. These conditions are what controls the groundwater flow. Basically the steering and direction, kind of like somebody in a luge. Without some boundaries, that poor guy is going to fly out and go anywhere and everywhere. So there has to be a boundary, at least on the sides and at the top and the bottom, somehow to control what happens inside that luge. So we'll write Darcy's luge law now. Redoing our little earlier lesson on groundwater flow. This is luge flow. It's basically the same principle. We have a discharge, area and coefficient of proportionality, and a gradient. So Q is the discharge rate of human beings out the bottom end here. They start here, they go down here, they discharge out the end. K is the coefficient of human skill and coarse tortuosity. This is some proportionality constant or variable. A is the cross-sectional area across the track, and gradient, DHDL, is just the starting height minus the bottom height over the length of the change in height. The initial condition is one rider is going to enter the starting gate, and there are no barriers to flow at the outlet. Okay, so we've got a prescribed inflow, and basically a drain at the other end. But this is saying this guy can go in and there's nothing that's going to stop him along the way. There's no impediment. There's really no conductivity in this case. It's just basically an open drain, which is something you can model in MODFLOW. But I could say, you know, there could be a different initial condition. There could be 40 people in here, and that might affect the way things behave. Boundary conditions. We have a constant inlet height and a constant outlet height. We're not going to move this track around during the race. If we were, we would need to change these boundary conditions. We would have to make this a specified height here and here. If we're going to change it over the course of his race, we have to make those changes in the model. But we're going to hold them constant here and here. And we're going to also say you are not allowed to flow outside the immediate limits of the track. Okay, so groundwater, in this case, in an aquifer, you're going to say, we got mountains on either side of this basin that are going to basically contain all the groundwater flow and prevent anything from going outside your basin. So, then we run the model, and you know, the guy goes in, he slides down, he comes out, and that's all described here in this equation. Some important things to note: initial conditions are what set up, you know, the starting condition for action. Without boundaries, anything can happen. The guy will fly out and die. Flow rate is proportional to gradient. If we did lower the starting elevation, the guy wouldn't go as fast, right? So the gradient has changed, and the flow rate would change. The boundaries control the direction of flow. So is that clear? Everybody knows how to do the luge now? All right. So, when we talk about running a groundwater model and boundary conditions, it's kind of nice to think about this statement here. A groundwater problem is defined by establishing appropriate boundary volume problem. Solving the problem involves solving for the governing partial differential equation in the flow domain while at the same time satisfying the specified boundary and initial conditions. So without some limits on the equation, it can't be solved. It has to have limits, and those limits are the boundary and initial conditions. And in this case, our simple little example that we've been showing, there's a no-flow boundary on the left, a no-flow boundary on the bottom, and a discharge boundary here, which is just a stream. We could specify a head here. We can say that head is never going to change, and that would control the rate of outflow. Or we could say this head depends on the head in the aquifer. So actually, if water starts pouring in here faster, the head in the stream could change. So it doesn't have to remain constant. It's just one type of boundary. But we do have to say something about how groundwater has to behave here and here. Really, the input is across the surface. So there's no behavior across these two boundaries. And groundwater flow can only flow perpendicular to lines of equal head. And I don't show that here, but if we were going to show the lines, you know, there was a high head here and a lower head here, and if you distributed the difference in head across that, it would look something like vertical lines, vertical contours going from here to here. And these flow lines have to go perpendicular to that. They always flow perpendicular to the head gradient. So there's a lot of different kinds of boundaries in MODFLOW that you can choose from. And some are, like I said, everybody has a different preference for how to do these things. Some, to me, don't make a lot of sense. But in the case of a very long-term modeling period or a very well-managed lake or river, you might have reason to set up a constant head boundary. So this means no change over time. If you have a river or dam or something, you know, controlling that system, you know that it's never going to change. That makes sense to specify a head there. Likewise, if you just have no idea what the flux is on the downstream end of your model, what water is leaving your model area, you might just set it as a constant head because you don't have any better information. Specified head says, okay, we know that this reservoir or this lake changes seasonally, for example. We know that they store water in Lake Mead in the wintertime and let it out in the summertime, and there's a record of how that lake is managed. So we know the downstream end of our basin kind of what those heads are over time historically. We may not know what they're going to be in the future, but we can certainly do history matching to the heads in the past. And we do that, we tell the model what that is. We don't make the model solve for that. We make that a condition of the model. So this is an important boundary in your model, this downstream specified head. And it can change over time, and it can change from one model cell to the next to the next. A no-flow boundary is easy. That can be a, just bedrock, basically, on the bottom or on the sides. Specified flux, this says it's not controlled by head at all. It's just a constant tap that's turned on, flowing at a certain rate all the time. And this is a little different, too. This could be, in some cases, like in the San Pedro Basin, the downstream end of the basin is really a bottleneck where groundwater is squeezed kind of into a narrow area and then it flows into the next basin. And that is simulated as a specified flux, which means no matter what happens inside the upper San Pedro Basin with pumping, with recharge, whatever, that rate of discharge out of the basin stays constant because the model is told to keep it constant. Guess what? It's also a free source of water then. That means even though I may put pumping wells right next to those specified flux head cells in the model, my wells are always going to have water because that flux the flux is never going to change no matter what my wells are pumping. So it's a little bit artificial. You have to be very careful with this kind of boundary. Better is to specify a head-dependent flux. So these change in response to head changes. So for a leaky aquifer under a lake, or in special cases, evapotranspiration, streams and drains. And it could be the same thing at the end of a basin where, you know, if I have a big well field right before my basin discharges into the next basin, the discharge into the next basin is going to get reduced over time. Really, I'm going to suck some of that water out. Some of that water is going to be prevented from leaving the basin. So that flux will change over time as the heads in my aquifer change over time. So this is a much more realistic type of boundary to use in that case. But these are all, you know, subjective, and people choose them to accomplish various things in models. But it's something to look at. When you get a model, you're going to have a report that tells you what the boundary conditions are and where. And it's important to think about them and say, you know, is this really meaningful? And usually they have a good logical justification for why they're doing what they're doing, and they show you what they specified. Here's a very simple case, a 2D model, where there's a little topographic high here, which constitutes a watershed divide on the surface and a groundwater divide. So we're kind of modeling that as a no-flow boundary. Why? Because flow is always perpendicular to lines of constant head. So even though there might be flow going this direction and this direction, for our purposes in our basin, it's a no-flow boundary. Nothing's coming across it. No flow across the basement and no flow at this groundwater divide where there's a stream. All the flow's coming from this way toward the stream and this way toward the stream. So there's no groundwater crossing this divide either. So in effect, it's a no-flow boundary. The only thing controlling flow here is the height of the water table above the stream. So as this varies, discharge to the stream varies. And I know that these are no-flow boundaries here because I can see the differential equation that says change in head over space is 0 on all three sides here. And here, head is dependent on a coefficient and elevation. So it's like conductivity and head here. So anyway, this is just simple representation of a 2D model. One boundary condition that, it's one of my favorite ones, and it's also one of the kind of most frequently used and maybe poorly understood. So I think it's worth a little extra time to talk about it. And that is ET, evapotranspiration boundary. So when we do modeling, I'll talk about this later, but there's steady state model, that's the pre-development model. You have to run that to get initial conditions for the transient model, which is when you start mucking around with human beings and they're pumping wells and recharge projects. But ET is something that exists before humans, and it's in the steady state model as well. If and only if plants can access groundwater. If you have plants that live along an ephemeral wash, like the grasses and maybe some, I don't know, salt cedar maybe, that's not a good example, but any kind of annuals that might green up in the spring when there's flow there, but then die off as soon as the flow stops, those are not accessing groundwater. They have shallow roots. They may get a little soil moisture for a few months after the stream goes away, but they're not accessing the water table. Those plants are not going to be in the groundwater model. That ET is not part of the system. That ET is subtracted out from recharge. So recharge already, what you plug in as recharge in the model already accounts for those losses, okay? This is only about plants like mesquite and salt cedar and deep-rooted grasses, things that can actually access the water table. So what this says is that it's a head-dependent condition, and this is depth, okay? We can talk about the surface being, let's just call this the surface of the earth, and it's called the ET surface. So at this point, if water is ponding at the surface, that's kind of the maximum rate of ET you can achieve. Plants use it, and it's evaporating, and it's just kind of, that's as fast as you can get the water out of the system with plants. So that value of Q, discharge, this is the ET, that's at its maximum right here at the ET surface. When you go down into the aquifer, or into the soil zone, there's a certain point below which, it's called the expiration depth, below which plants can't access it, so ET goes to 0. So ET varies linearly. this how it's simulated. I'm not saying it does, but this is how MODFLOW simulates it. Varies linearly between these two elevations. So if I have a water table somewhere in the middle here, below the surface but above the expiration depth, my plant will be able to get this much ET. If I have it close to the surface, it'll be able to transpire more. If it's deeper, right above the expiration depth, it'll barely get any water. And that's how MODFLOW controls that head-dependent relationship between ET and the groundwater system. So to put it to life a little bit, here's a picture of a root zone. Here's a little plant, you know, with its nice roots digging into the ground, and here's some ponded water at the surface, and this is somewhere in the Midwest, obviously not here. Some piece of alfalfa or something growing here, and whatever water, you know, gets past this ET flux going on at the surface comes down and gets into the deeper groundwater system and becomes recharged, but it has to get past all this first. So if we have a water table here, you can see right away that these parts of the roots are not activated, right? They can't get to this water, but this part can. So we're somewhere in this zone. If we say that this is that D value, the depth between ET surface and here, I could put the D up here, but anyway, for discussion, if this is the HS surface and this is the expiration depth, you know, as this water table drops, this plant's going to get less and less water until it gets down to here and it won't get any. I should probably have put the, you know, I should have put another slide showing water all the way at the surface, and then D would be up here. But anyway, it's just to show you that this plant's life depends on this groundwater elevation. And as soon as it gets too deep, the groundwater will become recharged and will be inaccessible to the plant. Okay. So I told you that we need to figure out what initial conditions are, and that's done by creating a separate model called steady state model. Same model geometry, same input parameters for the geology characteristics, the conductivity, the porosity, maybe fracture zones. All that stuff is constant across both models, but the steady state model has no pumping and no time. All right, so we have starting heads. We've stuck those in as a very rough estimate. They could be totally flat in the steady state model. It doesn't matter because this model is going to run and run and run and run and run until it comes up with a good solution for the head configuration. And it doesn't matter what time steps you use because it's just natural processes. There's no human-induced changes to the system yet. So we put in our hydraulic parameters, starting heads, boundary heads, and fluxes based on natural conditions. So the fluxes may be different in history. Back in 1935, before Lake Mead was in action, there was a different boundary than today. So that model is different than the transient model that includes that new condition in Lake Mead. But you still have ET as a function of depth, and you still have the same kind of stream bed qualities that determine how fast recharge can make it through the system into the groundwater, and you still have natural recharge. Of course, natural recharge may not be constant either. This is a big hang-up we have a lot of modeling. We think of natural recharge as being sort of the average over a century or something. We kind of are seeing now that natural recharge has a period of oscillation of some sort, and that may be 50 to 100 years. We don't really know. So when we say, you know, we just hold natural recharge constant across all our transient models, that we can run into problems with that. The good news is that recharge process is so slow that in the period of time that we're really interested in most of the time with human action, it's not going to matter a whole lot. If recharge is varying every 100 years, it's not going to matter so much. But if we're going to run the model for 200 or 300 years, it does matter. Anyway, just to say, natural recharge is a big question mark most of the time. So once the steady state model is run and it's just set up, it's like Darcy's law. It's just running. It's the same inflow all the time, the same outflow all the time. All it's showing is that this is what the system looks like with no perturbations from humans. After that, we start putting in human-caused changes to the groundwater system. And this is called the transient model because it's changing with time. What do those look like? Well, they could be similar to what we saw in the past with trees near the stream, except this time these could be planted trees. So this is inducing an upward flux, a discharge in terms of transpiration. This could be also a crop of alfalfa. Anything that's able to access groundwater would be a new discharge point for groundwater. Here's an example of an injection well. So this would be an input to the recharge, to the groundwater system. And here's our same graphic before, except this time I put in a man-made recharge basin in this little swale. And so you can see a groundwater mound starting to develop. And remember, that's important. We talked about this earlier, but for those of you who weren't there, if you have an unsaturated zone between land surface and the water table, you don't really begin to see the benefits of any recharge until that groundwater mound is fairly close to the surface. That could mean still 50 feet down if it's a 300 or 400 foot thick zone, but you got to be able to see in your meaningful time period your water get into the groundwater zone. And if it takes 50 years for it to percolate to the groundwater zone, don't expect to be using it until that happens. Yeah, and of course pumping wells. That's the biggest impact we have on our system. So transient model inputs include everything that was in the steady state model. They might have some new boundaries, but generally, yeah, the fluxes change on the downstream end, for example, or the specified head will change. We have this, like at Lake Mead, there's a specified head there. It's just constant in steady state. But once the Lake Mead management begins, the new heads are specified to match the historic levels in Lake Mead in the transient model. You also have stress periods. So there has to be some time step in the model. Each stress period is comprised of various time steps. These are just the periods over which the model is solving these equations. So you have to put time into the model when you run transient. And the stress periods often reflect whatever management goals you're interested in and how your system behaves. You may want a seasonal time step. You may want a monthly time step. You may want a decadal time step. And it can vary within a model. You may model the first 70 years when you didn't have much data as sort of, 5-year time steps. And then when you get into the current period where you have a lot more information, you might break that down into 6-month intervals or something like that. So it can vary according to the data you have and your interests. Pumping rates over time, obviously, incidental recharge. So when human beings come along and build infrastructure and they leak, that can be built in. Agricultural ET and managed aquifer recharge. So this would be intentional recharge, not just incidental. So this is the main difference between transient and steady state, is that now we have human inputs and outputs as well as natural. So what do you get? Yeah.
Sorry, a question for you, I think on your last slide.
Okay.
You had mentioned that until that groundwater mound is built,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to see really that water get back into the aquifer.
Correct.
What if your recharge is so intermittent? I mean, what does it take to build that groundwater?
That's an excellent question. It really, really depends. If you're in Abra Valley in southern Arizona, it could be, 300 feet to groundwater. So the more consistent you are with your inputs, the more you're going to set up a flux, a continuous flux, which is going to happen much more quickly. It's going to make that mound build quickly. The wetter the soil is, the more quickly water transmits through it. The drier it is, the worse it transmits. And if it dries out completely, you can start getting upward gradients in the upper few feet. So that means if you wet and dry, and you only have a little bit of water, you could lose all of it in the soil zone. And it may just evaporate back out again. You have to have enough persistence and volume to break through that unsaturated zone and set up a flux, a downward flux, and overcome those evaporative forces at the surface.
I guess, how often are we talking? Are we talking like a rain every couple of months? Are we talking?
It really depends. If you have a 10-foot depth water, that might work fine. If If you have 300 feet, it might not work at all. I would say it wouldn't work very well at all if you have only a couple hundred acre feet of recharge. But it's very site dependent, site specific. This is why effluent is your friend when it comes to recharge, because it's a constant source of water. You never have to turn it off. You might move it over a little bit from basin to basin, but you never have to turn it off. So your mound develops and it just grows and grows and grows forever without succumbing to this intermittent, effluent upward flux, which is very detrimental to a recharge process. Plus, anytime you get drying like that, you build up air gaps in the soil that are difficult to overcome. So when you start wetting a basin, you see a lot of bubbling. It's hard to get through air. That's part of the permeability of the unsaturated zone, is that it's got air in the way. It has to be overcome, and water has to go around those bubbles. So if you can avoid that, if you can just let it dry on the surface but not too deep, you manage. It's a very important management process, and a lot of people don't understand that. A recharge project is not something you build and walk away from. And if it's an effluent management system, it's actively managed day by day. Okay? Yes. Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you asked that question. I'm actually, this is a very hard question to answer because there haven't been a lot of experiments to really measure it. How do you measure it? But there's a lot of debate about this issue. And in the modeling report for this area, they have a very big number for incidental recharge for septics. It's over 3,000 acre feet per year, which strikes me as quite high, very high. I was really surprised to see that. And I'm not a septic installer. Please don't take me too much at my word on this. But what I understand is that modern septic systems, the standards have changed a bit, and there tends to be more evaporative losses and less recharge. So the newer the subdivision, if it has septics that are less than 50 years old or whatever, tend to recharge less. And they want to contain more of it at the surface and grow grass instead of letting it percolate to the groundwater system for whatever reason. It's actually, in some cases, worth taking a look at the age of the subdivision if you're really trying to pin down incidental recharge, because there are more leaks associated with older subdivisions, and the septics are a different configuration. I can't answer exactly, but I did notice that the reference they gave for the recharge rate for septics was a person named Kevin Lanzi at U of A, who's a civil engineer, and he's cited as the same reference in the San Pedro Basin. So that means there's really not a wide body of evidence to answer this question, and it would be nice if we could devise a good experiment to really figure it out, because the problem is we have a lot of information about East Coast and Midwest, but when it comes to hundreds of feet of unsaturated zone, even if that water gets in there, if you got 30 gallons a year or whatever coming through, when are you going to see that at the water table? And for all practical purposes, is it something that can even be really considered in the time period of interest? It's a good question. All right, so what are we looking for when we run a transient model? It really depends on where you are, what your interests are, but first of all, the head distribution. So the water table, in each layer of the model, you may have many layers, you may have many different aquifers in your model. You may have a superficial aquifer that does one thing, you may have a deeper aquifer that does another thing. You may produce from one or more aquifers with your pumping wells. You may recharge into one aquifer and produce from another. So this model can tell you can stop it at any moment in time and examine that head distribution and see how it's changing over time. You can see every single face of every single model cell at any given time you want. This is kind of amazing. I mean, if you have 100,000 cells, You can actually go to the layer in the model and the cell that you want to see and look at the fluxes in and out of that cell that are simulated at any given time step. So if you want to see estimated or simulated flows every 5 days in layer 4 of your model, you can do that. It's a very detail-oriented process, but what this allows you to do is also set up zones. You can say, well, overall in this part of the basin, what is the amount of recharge that's coming in, and what is the amount of flux out through wells? So you can identify areas of the model in which you're interested. One thing I often look at is base flow, stream base flow, which is a tricky definition that we'll cover a little bit later, but this is the groundwater-driven part of a stream. And so I will stop a model frequently and say, okay, well, under this, at this time in history or under this scenario of recharge, how's that affecting the stream? And how long does it take for recharge at this location to manifest as a change in base flow at this location? You can do the flow budget for the entire model or for one cell or for one zone. Very handy. And these flow budgets include all the different elements of stress and storage. So wells, pumping wells, injection wells, aquifer storage change. Okay, remember I said water is going to come from somewhere. When you put in a pumping well, you're either sucking it from the part of the aquifer right around the well, or you're inducing leakance from some other source of capture. So recharge, ET, stream-based flow, drains, and any other boundaries. All this stuff is available for inspection at every time step. And model calibration, I talked about this a little bit before, but it's an iterative process, and it attempts to replicate known or estimated historic conditions by manipulating prescribed variables such as conductivity, specified fluxes, ET rates. It's an arduous process. It's sometimes done manually, trial and error. I think the permeability or the conductivity is between 10 to the minus 6 and 10 to the minus 4. I'm going to plug that in and see what happens. Oh, it turns out it's 10 to the minus 2. I'm going to try that. Back and forth until you settle on some solution. That's a very hard way to do it. There's a lot of automated processes now that do inverse modeling. So you give it a final head and a starting head, and you say, you figure it out, how we got to this point. And the model will solve things backwards. Steady state and transient calibrations are needed. And you need some data, right? People ask me all the time, shouldn't we have a smaller grid size? Why would we want a 1 kilometer grid size for a model? Well, there are a few reasons. One is that it's quick to solve. The fewer cells you have, the faster the model runs. That's not a really good reason. The main reason is you don't need a grid that's any more detailed than your data set that you're trying to match or simulate. You may think that you have a lot of resolution in your data, but if you look at the basin and see where your actual water level measurements are, and there's only 16 across the whole basin, a 1 kilometer grid might make sense. So it really just depends on the density of the data that you have and what you're trying to characterize. Some important assumptions. I told you this several times, but conditions are constant across the entire cell. So when you put a pumping well into a model cell, it's going to extract water from all saturated parts of that cell until the cell goes dry, and then the well will turn off. That's another thing to recognize. If you don't specifically tell the model not to do that, you may think everything's going along fine because you don't see any dry cells in your model, or you see, if you're not careful, you won't notice that a pumping well has shut down unless you look at your flow budget and look at how much pumping is going on. And then you realize, oh, wait a minute, pumping has reduced over time. I didn't tell it to do that. It's doing that because of the head condition in the model. So it's important to monitor what's happening as you run a model, especially out forward in time. I've run models in the Prescott area, for example, where I had to change a lot of things just to get the model to run because wells were just going dry so fast. I couldn't support the amount of pumping that was predicted to happen in the places where pumping was happening today. So, things dry out, and that can affect pumping. Aquifer transmissivity is constant. Transmissivity is just the conductivity of the cell multiplied by its saturated thickness. MODFLOW assumes, and the flow equation assumes, that transmissivity is constant. We don't have a mechanism for changing that during a model run. That's something that's fixed. So you can actually specify a variable condition in MODFLOW now that allows you to say, okay, I'm going to let this term vary with head. But it's an option. It's not built in, and it's a special case. And that is only important if you have like maybe a very small scale area that you're looking at where each well imposes such a great stress on the saturated thickness that it really does change the way groundwater flows. Wells are fully penetrating across the entire cell thickness. So even though your modeler may say, okay, I'm putting in the screen interval for every pumping well in your city, that screen interval simply tells the model which layer to put it in. But once it gets into a layer, it's screening effectively across the entire thickness of that layer. So important to understand that your layers need to represent the saturated thickness that most of your wells are producing from. It doesn't make sense to have a 1,000-foot layer and your wells are only producing from the top 200 feet. You need a separate layer to reflect that. Changes from one stress period to the next are constant. They're instantaneous. There's not like this gradual shift. Things change abruptly at the end of a time step and stress period. So that's not usually important, but that's an assumption that happens in the model. What MODFLOW doesn't do, it's almost as important as what it does do. We don't do storm runoff. Remember that surface water thing? That's their stuff. I don't deal with surface water a whole lot in terms of storm runoff. There are some new ways of doing that in MODFLOW, but I have not yet used them. So if you're familiar with, stormwater hydrographs or streamflow hydrographs, you see these storm peaks, and then you see this overall base flow condition, and that is what I'm talking about here. Base flow, not storm flow. Okay. We also don't really do storm runoff routing, streamflow routing. There is something called the streamflow routing package, but remember the time steps in groundwater are not at all like the time steps in surface water. You're talking about hours. We're talking about decades. I mean, it's kind of hard to mix and match those. So it's a little bit difficult, and this is really just a way of kind of better approximating stream flow conditions. But these are base flow conditions, not storm runoff, too. So it's talking about routing only this part of the hydrograph from one model cell to the next. We don't account for any ET losses that are using strictly precip and not groundwater. We don't simulate vadozone process unless you specifically add that into the model, which can be done with a certain package. But generally, when recharge is applied, and so MODFLOW has a shortcoming here. It will take a flux that you put in on the surface. You want to model recharge on the surface, like an effluent recharge system. It'll take that flux and apply it to the entire model cell area. Okay, even though your recharge basin might be the size of this floor here, if your model cell is 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, it's going to take that flux and apply it across the entire surface of that cell. So that's a little issue there. And it's going to instantaneously put that water at the water table and add it to the water level of the groundwater system there, across your time step. So it doesn't have this lag in storage. It's basically like the steady state condition is already, the equilibrium has already been set up. So if you want to simulate a new recharge system, it's important to have that vadozone built into the model in a different way. You probably need a different model just for that system and that very small scale issue. Okay. Breather. I'm ready for a breather and a drink of water. So we don't have a whole lot. We're going to finish a lot earlier than we thought maybe, but what I have left are some examples of other projects I've done and scenarios that we've run, and then Joe and Cy. So I'm not sure if we want to take when we want to take a break. I probably have like 15 more minutes. Okay. There's no the groundwater is groundwater, but unless you're producing from that saline zone. Sorry, unless you're producing from the saline zone, you're not going to stimulate an upward gradient. Unless you're producing right above it, you're not going to change. You're not going to sort of induce mixing. But that is not something that MODFLOW can tell you. Not really. No, I don't think so. No, unless there's some drying that occurs and some precipitation of minerals, but it doesn't matter if it's what the chemistry is. The water flows the same way. But what I will say is that often many basins have that saline water at depth, and that is a result of old, ancient seas that had evaporated and left salts behind and then got buried. And those salt deposits remain there, but they began to wet up during the glacial period. So that's very common across most of the basins. Typically, we don't produce from those depths unless it's critical, like in El Paso. They're starting to tap into brine or brackish water in El Paso and treat it with RO because they've basically run out of fresh water. So this will be a source in the future for a lot of people, but it's a very expensive source, and we don't want to go there if we can avoid it. Okay. Maybe I have more than 15 minutes. Let me see. So here's an example from Sierra Vista area, San Pedro Basin, Upper San Pedro. And I like this. I like the fact that your basin is kind of analogous to this. It's not the same at all, but it's analogous. It's a basin and range province structure. So over here are mountains. Here's the San Pedro River, and it flows also from south to north, like your system does. Recharge occurs over here in the mountains and in some ephemeral streams that flow across the alluvial basin. Sierra Vista is in here, and this is the pumping center for this basin. Most of the people live in this area, and so almost all the pumping wells, the big ones, are in this area. And of course, everyone's interested in this part of the San Pedro River because it's a national riparian conservation area. It's called SPRNCA. So this is federal land now, and this is a federal reserved water right. A lot of interest in what might happen to this river as a result of pumping, which has been a solid employment plan for me for quite a while now. I've been doing this, working on this model for about a decade. So this is, what I showed you first was a steady state condition. This is where humans have not yet impacted the system. And you can see these contour lines are equal head values. So there's a natural gradient toward the northeast. And down here it's a little more toward the east. But groundwater naturally moved in that direction before we disturbed it. After some pumping was imposed for quite a while, and this is in 2013, you can see the heads, the flow lines changing in response to head. Now I want you to notice this axis of impact. Okay, the colors in the blues and greens are much paler here. I'm going to go back. You see darker blues and then greenish yellow, and that is the development of a cone of depression in response to Sierra Vista and Fort Huachuca's pumping. It affects the whole basin area. The whole thing's a little bit paler if you look carefully. So what's happening now is there's a groundwater divide. Remember that divide term We've created an artificial divide here by pumping on this side and interrupting natural flow that would have made it to the river. So we're intercepting natural recharge here that ordinarily, under natural conditions, would have discharged at the river. We got a new discharge point, and that affects the flow lines. So initially, there was no groundwater divide, but after some time, we've developed this groundwater divide that goes all the way down here. And you can see the flow lines kind of going off in different directions. If we have a well, I'm just putting a little point here as an observation point to look at what the heads are doing along this groundwater divide. It's a no-flow line. Water's not crossing. I mean, some water is still flowing to the river, but it's that case where this is a less gaining stream than it used to be. So it's a divide, but it's not actually no flow boundary at depth. So we look at this elevation. Let's just look at the feet for a minute. 4152. By 2100, now this is a future model prediction, that 2013 divide was here. Now it's moved out a bit toward the river. Okay, the cone of depression is expanding. You can see more flow toward the cone of depression, less flow toward the river. And if we go and look at that same little spot again, at 4086, the previous slide it was, 4152. So you can see a definite decline in head over that 100-year period, and the groundwater divide has shifted a little bit. Not a lot. That's the important thing here, is actually the divide is not moving a whole lot, but it's deepening. So what does that do to the river? This is a graphic, a slice. Let me go back. This cross section here, A prime. I'm going to take a cross section right through the middle of the system and plot the heads here. So this is the cone of depression in Sierra Vista. This is the river. A lot of vertical exaggeration for clarity, but Sierra Vista's here. Their wastewater treatment plant that recharges quite a bit, between 2,500 and 3,000 acre feet a year of recharge, actively recharging. And it started in 2003, so it's been going now for 15 years, and it's had a substantial impact on the system. But as of 1902, pre-development condition, the head distribution was like this, pretty straight across the basin toward the river. By 2013, that cone of depression had brought this groundwater divide into play, dropped the heads all over the alluvial basin, and now that gradient between the mountains and the river is reduced by 17% over historic conditions. By 2100, that cone of depression is deeper. The groundwater divide is also deeper, and that means the gradient has now doubled to negative 35%. And we know from Darcy's law that discharge is proportional to gradient. Remember the luge? We change the gradient, we change the amount of flow coming out the other end. So what does that tell you about flow getting to the river? Is less than it used to be. Okay, so this is a simple, straightforward example of why gradient matters and why a cone of, even though you're pumping from far away, why does it matter? It matters because you're influencing what's happening between there and the discharge point. So yeah, gradient really matters. Of course, depends on where you look. You know, the fact that this divide is here is still helpful because there still is a gradient. Eventually, if this gradient, if the divide flattens out, there would be no flow toward the river. So this is a form of interception capture. And I'm just showing, the lines don't really show up that well, but I was just showing the different positions of the groundwater divide here. These lines don't really show up, but it doesn't move much, which is kind of interesting because people perceive that the groundwater divide is going to intersect the river someday, and that's when things are going to get terrible. But actually, that's not necessary for things to get terrible. Yeah. It is. Yeah. Now that was 2013 conditions. 5 years later, they've put a lot more water in the ground since then. So this might change. If I ran it again, I might get a bit of a different result. Yeah.
Is that what's helping to keep your divide there?
That is what's helping, yeah.
Next one will go out 15 years.
Yeah, yeah, but it's a ton of water. They have rapid infiltration basins. They also have a wetland. They have a lot of wetlands, and then they've started to shrink that down a bit in favor of the recharge basins. But now they're concerned about the mound underneath the basins intersecting the surface. So there's a point where too much of a good thing can actually make it impossible to recharge, and you might have to move a little bit. And they're actually contemplating that issue. But to tell you the truth, if it weren't for this EOP, let me go back. The EOP is right here. And you can see, that groundwater divide stops right there. And this is the steepest gradient toward the river right here. So there's a lot of flow coming out of that mound, and it's really supporting flows in this part of the river. There's no doubt about it. It's having a huge impact. Depths of water under the mound, under the recharge basins now. I think originally it was probably on the order of 60 feet. Now it's probably on the order of 30, something like that. So yeah, it didn't take a whole long time for them to build up a meaningful mound because they had a lot of water and it was continuously applied in a pretty small area. Okay. Moving on into your neck of the woods. I'm going to grab another drink real quick. And I can barely see this on my slide, so I'm sure you can't see it, so I'll try to walk you through it. But these are some data from the ADWR groundwater level change map from 1991 to 2003, 2004. And ADWR does these well sweeps. Yes? Yeah, I know. And I have another map that's a little bit more updated. This was the previous one they did, yeah. So they do these well sweeps in basins that are expected to be contentious in some way, typically. If there's a legal push and they have to do a hydrographic survey report, this is kind of the first step for that. So they do them in San Pedro, they do them here, they do them in the Verde, but very periodically, like every decade or so. But as they come through, they measure what few index wells they have. This means wells that the owner has agreed to give them access to over time, or else ones that they own or the feds have owned for a long time or whatever. Some wells that they can come back to over time and repeat measurements in. And there aren't a whole lot. There's a few dots here. And basically the greens and blues are positive change and the reds are negative change down in here. It still says these flow lines are still moving in the mostly north direction toward Lake Mead, except for this one right here, which happens to be moving toward Kingman. So we all understand that. There's pumping wells here, and it's induced a change in the flow regime. This is some basic information that you can get from the Groundwater Atlas on the ADWR website if you're interested. Well yields, they say between less than 100 to more than 2,000 gallons a minute. Based on 33 reported wells, median well yield is 900 GPM. 33 wells, it's actually a fairly good amount for this size of a basin, but groundwater information is just generally not very plentiful. And part of that is the way groundwater is regulated or not regulated in the state. People don't have to tell anyone what's going on in their well. They don't have to share that information. They don't even know that information. Most people don't have any idea what's going on in their well. So we're lucky to have what few data points exist. Natural recharge is in the range of 2,000 to 3,000 acre-feet per year. Recharge principally from stream bed infiltration. So what they're not saying here is that that stream bed infiltration is the result of precip on the mountains, which then gets into ephemeral channels that run into the basin. Water storage estimates range from 3 to 5.3 million acre feet to a depth of 1,200 feet. And then below that, back in 1971, USGS estimated between 10.5 and 21 million acre feet down to 1,500 feet. So there's a 300-foot difference here in these estimates and a whole lot of water. So I guess it's pretty uncertain what is really down there at depth. There haven't been, I don't know if there have been any wells drilled that deep. Certainly not many. And if there's saline water, I mean, I don't know. But often there's, like in many basins, there's Tenneco Oil Company or somebody like that might have come along at some point with an interest and drilled a really deep well just to see what was there. And so sometimes we have these really deep data points. I actually have not looked to see if any of those exist here. This is a more recent ADWR map. So this is considering their 2000, you said they just came through? Okay, so this is only considering the 2006 well sweep. They'll do another one of these maps eventually, but I don't have those data yet. So this is for the Lake Mohave area, I guess, but this is the Hualapai Basin blown up here in more detail. And this just says late 80s, mid 90s to mid-late 2000s. But you can see the general pattern, red around Kingman. There's a few blue ones here. And kind of a mixed bag going north. There's some red here, blue here, but not many wells, except in this little space outside the basin. These are the primary background studies that were done by USGS in preparation for building a model here. So I'll refer to different parts of each one of these reports a little bit in my presentation. And the USGS relied heavily on what was found in these studies for constructing its current model. You've seen this before. This is the conceptualized hydrogeology and structure of this basin, and the two types of mountain recharge, one sort of in-place recharge, we'll call it, and one ephemeral or runoff recharge. And that's an important distinction because the model considered two ways of applying natural recharge, and those are the two different ways, either in place in the mountains or over the alluvium. And here's the report by Tillman et al., 2013. This was the preliminary groundwater flow model that they developed, and it was a very basic model, mostly as a test of their conceptual understanding of the basin. It reasonably matched historic conditions, but it wasn't designed to allow future simulations of greater pumping. So it was very simple, but it did give them good insight as to the water budget and how it, if it was appropriate as we understood it, as they understood it. So a single model layer modeled over this transient period, 1935 to 2010, and a 1,000-meter grid, square grid. These were the time steps. So there were 21 time steps ranging from, this is the steady state here, the first time step, and then 1935 up to 2005. And this just tells the start dates. They varied in length from a few years, like 5 years, to a few months. This is the water budget concept that they applied in the transient model. So there's mountain block runoff and recharge. There's some natural recharge directly, some runoff that went into ephemeral streams. Some of that went into the unsaturated zones. Some of that went into the groundwater system. There were human inputs over here. So ET, like agriculture, and consumptive use, like swimming pools or car washes or whatever consumptive uses, gardening. What does that say? I can't even see it. Can you read that? I don't know. Interbasin transfers, okay. Anyway, this is what the whole transient model was built on, was these known extractions or inputs over time. So that's put into the model, and then the model solves for head condition over time. So remember we talked about boundary conditions, and this is a graphic just showing the types of boundaries that they use. They use the prescribed flux boundary along Lake Mohave and Lake Mead and the Colorado River. And these are the conditions they put in. This was historic water levels in Lake Mead, I believe. I really can't read this stuff, so yeah, Lake Mead, Lake Mohave, and okay, thank you. Sorry, I can't read it. But anyway, these were prescribed fluxes that were used as boundaries to the model system. So this is an unusual case where the history is well known. The fluxes or the head condition at the edges of the basin are well known. We don't actually usually have this kind of information, so it's nice to have a good control on groundwater flow conditions. They did a steady state model two different ways with two different recharge conditions. So the first was this in-place recharge, and that is where precipitation falls on the mountains and recharges in the mountains. And we know that to be somewhat misleading, and the recharge actually happens kind of right at the base of the mountains, and they plugged it in that way into the model as well, it's happening in the mountain block areas. That's called in-place recharge. They use something called the basin BCM model. I forget what the acronym stands for, but it's the whole southwest area was modeled to determine natural recharge based on things like precipitation, temperature, elevation, soil moisture. So it was a very generalized look at natural recharge fluxes across the entire Southwest. And they took that information and plugged it in here based on elevations, topographic shading, precipitation, which they didn't derive it, but it was gotten from the PRISM Climate Data Center. So simulated precipitation for the whole historic period. So that was recharge. They used the recharge package in MODFLOW to simulate in-place recharge. And it's applied as a length per time, a flux over the entire model cell at each cell, as opposed to a well, which would be a volumetric flow rate injected into the ground. The one exception was the Truxton wash inflow to the basin, somewhere over here, right here. That was simulated as a well. It's just simply they estimated how much water recharged into the alluvium when it hit the basin, and they just injected that into the model right there. So they did say that this could be an area of improvement where this could be turned into a stream in the model instead of just an injection well, or represented that way. So that's something to consider if, well, I don't know what Jake Knight is planning there. I don't think he's planning to change it, but it is one area they said could be an area of improvement. This is a look at their head matching. So I neglected to say they did another type of recharge. Let me go back for a minute. Instead of this in-place mountain recharge, they also did another type of recharge where they took all the available moisture from the mountains and put it into ephemeral streams and estimated how much would recharge into the alluvium. They did the steady state model both ways, and then they compared the head matching resulting from those two different steady state models. And yeah, there's some differences. This was the in-place recharge, and this was the ephemeral stream recharge. And you can see that the blues indicate how much they overestimate. The bigger the circle, the more overestimated the heads were. The reds were underestimated according to the size of the circle, was how much they were underestimating the heads. So in the mountain front condition, or the mountain recharge condition, they're sort of underestimating more in the basin wells, and in the ephemeral recharge condition, they're kind of overestimating more in the center of the basin. So they didn't really come out and say which way is better. They did use this recharge configuration for the transient model. Oops. So this was the preliminary model. This is a graphic showing the different stratigraphy at the surface, and then the zones. So this is sort of these dark blues are the mountain zones, and the light blues are the alluvial basins. And by the way, in case you don't know, Hualapai Basin is blessed with a ton more alluvium than most of the neighboring basins. You have a very deep and productive alluvial system here. So this bar here represents this cross-section that's shown here. And you can see it's just one single layer all the way down. Each model cell is very long and narrow. So this 1 kilometer grid across the surface and very deep, well, let's see, there's about 1,400 foot relief in the Z direction. This is the Hualapai Basin area, and you can see that here the alluvium propagates to total depth of the model, which isn't really necessarily the true condition. And this is the water table, simulated water table. So they knew there were some springs, and they knew some water levels in the basins, and that's what they were trying to match. And of course, they prescribed the head here at the outflow at Mohave Lake. So they felt that the model did a reasonably good job of simulating the historic conditions. Yeah.
If they were to have more layers in
Right, let me just show you. That's what Jake did here. So Jake at USGS, he created a 5-layer model in place of the single-layer model, holding most other things the same. But what he did was then cut off the alluvium where most of the wells say it ends. I mean, drillers typically go until they run out of easy drilling and easy water, and then they stop. So it's a good indication if you have a lot of 300-foot wells, that's probably a good indication that that's the bottom of a production zone. And there's a little deeper part here. But this way he's able to control that production. It's not propagating way down too deep. However, he needs that depth in order to have some kind of meaningful flow rate out the side of the model here. And then there's a little bit of alluvium in this basin. So and Jake explained to me he was having a lot of trouble with heads in the mountain front areas where it comes, the water surface is close to the ground surface. The model was not able to simulate it very well. So if you go back and look at the old one, flows were, this looks like a spring flow condition here, where groundwater table is intersecting the surface. But in Jake's model, you can see it's actually a bit below the surface. And he's able to accommodate pumping kind of near the mountain flanks without causing problems in the way the model runs. So what he did was he prescribed, it's something called a semi-structured grid, where you say, I've got a 1,400 foot thickness, divide that into 5 equal layers for me. And he did that, he put in all the elevations, and then the model just gave him 5 equal depth layers at each cell. Okay, so once you have your model, then what? And this is where your job really gets tough. Jake is waiting with bated breath for you to tell him what to do with his new toy. What kind of pumping are you going to have in the future? What kind of recharge are you going to have in the future? Where is development going to happen? Where is agriculture going to happen? You have to be some kind of fortune teller, or have sort of a window, an envelope of possibilities that you can consider. And that's where the art is in this part. It's really about identifying a problem, identifying potential solutions, and exploring the effectiveness of those trial solutions. So defining your problem first is really key. A good scenario answers a fundamental question. You have to have a question. How much water is needed to whatever, to do whatever, to build up a mound? Well, that's not a good question for MODFLOW, but to sustain water levels at a well field, for example. Let's say you're pumping your wells hard and you don't want to have to drill new wells, so you want to have recharge feeding into your well field over time. How much water is it going to take to make a meaningful contribution? What's the best location for a recharge project, for example, or a new well field that won't damage your current production zone in a certain amount of time? Which option works best? We want to combine two things and simulate them here and simulate them there. But you got to have a question first. It also incorporates the best estimates of future conditions. So your pumping projections are not just based on population growth, we know that. But generally, in most basins, population growth is key to projecting demand. However, demand is decoupled from population growth now. We're finding, like in Tucson, population has been growing steadily, but we are now consuming water at the same rate we were in 1980. So it's not a constant relationship anymore, and we have to understand that. If we project population out in the future, it's probably not accurate to just add that same linear projection to groundwater demand. We have to consider new trends in conservation and new behaviors of human beings. Per capita water use, so that's where I'm getting, is per capita water use changes over time, and industrial demand could be very different from now until the future. You never know. Amazon might come here. But the better information you have going forward, the better your scenario analysis will be. It compares alternative strategies by changing one variable at a time. It's not helpful if you're looking for the influence of one project to dial too many knobs at once. Just dial the one and then move it and dial it again and dial it again. Then go to the next problem and dial a different knob. Just be careful about combining too many changes at once or you'll lose resolution. It also has to reflect the community's objectives and interests. And this is that part in the modeling process, that bottom box where I said, once you've got your model, you've asked your questions, you've tested your solution techniques with some scenarios, the community might reevaluate and say, hey, look, that isn't actually what we need to do. We've learned something from this modeling process. We think we need to do something else. So that might send you back to the drawing board or just in a whole different direction. Typical scenario variables: pumping rates, artificial recharge rates, incidental and or managed. I mean, if you fix the leaks in your transmission losses, then you can take away some of that incidental recharge. So you have to be, consider that. Pumping locations. Sometimes problems can be solved by changing the location of a pumping well or pumping center. If you're having an impact on something that's very critical, like a stream or a wetland or a neighbor, sometimes the solution is to move farther away. Artificial recharge locations. You want to target, get as close as possible to the point of interest that you're trying to help. So if that's your production zone or some natural water body, you want to put that thing in a place where it's going to be meaningful. If you start recharging on top of a cone of depression and you're trying to help a stream that's outside the cone of depression, it's not likely to work. And that was a big question in the San Pedro. Should we work on the cone of depression, filling that in again, or should we work on shorter term issues with a stream and get closer to the stream? So this has been a big question, a big source of debate in the San Pedro for a long time. Crop ET rates. That it's not impossible for farmers to change. They just will tell you that it is. But a lot of farmers have grown cotton forever. They have cotton harvesting equipment. They have cotton harvesting knowledge, and it's in their blood, and they're never going to grow anything else. But occasionally, a farmer might say, well, alfalfa and barley aren't that different. I could modify my techniques. I could change my season, plant a cooler season plant instead of maybe planting in the midsummer heat and save a bunch of water that way. And so that's going on in the Verde Valley right now. Some farmers are converting from Bermuda or alfalfa to barley. They have a different market for that crop, but it's not that different to grow, it's just a different timing. So their ET losses are much lower because they're growing it in the winter and spring instead of in the heat of the summer. So that's an ET adjustment that could be made as a scenario. Seasonal duration. I don't know about you guys here, but in southern Arizona, we see saguaros blooming earlier every year, it seems like, and monsoon patterns changing. Snow melt, if we had any snow, we'd see it melting a lot earlier. Things are changing. Spring isn't necessarily where the mesquite trees always thought it was at the beginning of April. It's now somewhere in mid-March, if not earlier. And that adjustment makes a huge difference. If you have a seasonal time step in your model, you might try adjusting that back, because why? ET rates. ET turns on, and that's a huge sink. That's a huge output from your model. At least in the San Pedro, it's one of the biggest users of water. So if you turn that on 2 weeks earlier every year and let it run 2 weeks later every fall, you're going to change the water budget a lot. And it's very important to understand the magnitude of that impact. Here, not so much, but that's a possibility. All right, so I'm just playing around with something here. This is the Red Lake playa. And what I was looking at was this little group of pivots right here, right here. And I was thinking about why they're there. Sometimes farmers farm because they own land at a certain place, but sometimes there's a reason why they own land at a certain place. And sometimes there's a reason why wells are put in certain places. And this place is really interesting because it comes at the point where this mountain range is pinching out and running into this probably almost impermeable blob of playa deposits that are deep in the subsurface. So you might, I haven't verified this, but there might be a relatively shallow groundwater level here as the water table is sort of stuck. Water is not easily flowing past this little pinch out point. So this might be a reason why wells are highly productive here. It's just a hypothesis. I haven't tested it yet, but I'm just thinking about like where, if I were just going to cite a new well field, looking at this, I would say, oh, that makes some sense, and maybe in this area here, maybe being along the edge of this playa makes some sense because it's a barrier to flow, and water tends to pile up there in the groundwater system. So maybe along here, I don't know. Truxton Wash would also be a logical source of groundwater recharge, so maybe wells in here. But the thing about it is, if you're looking at future wells and future land development, you have zoning, you have all kinds of constraints. We'll talk about that later. But what I found interesting was when I overlaid your land use map or your land ownership map, the quilt, the patchwork of ownership does put some constraints on where any new development's going to occur. And I don't understand this. Maybe you guys can explain it to me, but how the feds own every other section is confusing. I've seen that on Indian reservations, but that's very kind of strange. Anyway, so you have some, human limits, human constraints on where development can occur, but there are also hydrologic reasons why someone might develop in a certain place. So it's important to consider both. And also in the thinking about placement of new recharge projects, thinking about the fact that your groundwater flow lines are in this direction toward Kingman here, and in that direction farther north. It's just important to understand the system and how you want to change it in order to design any kind of project. I mean, it's also okay to say, okay, this is where the water is, we're going to recharge it right now, but your expectations need to be framed logically. You can't, necessarily expect recharge in this area to have any impact on this. okay? So that's why you have a model, to help you understand the implications of the projects you're thinking about and maybe conceptualizing new projects that you hadn't thought about. Oh, time for a drink. We'll definitely finish up by lunch. This is my part. I don't know why I said I had 15 minutes earlier. That was crazy. Okay, so a couple of examples from Upper San Pedro Basin where we use trial and error to look at recharge and the potential impacts of that recharge. And as I showed you, this is again the San Pedro Basin, Sierra Vista is in here. This is the Sprinca flowing from the Mexican border to the north and gradually joins the Gila River. Interstate 10 comes along the top here. So this part of the river is the federal land and of high interest to a lot of parties. Baba Camaria is a tributary to the San Pedro. It's also very important land area. It's right adjacent to Fort Huachuca's East Range. And Fort Huachuca, if you don't know, is a military Air Force installation, no, Army installation that does a lot of very high-level secret communications, technical stuff there. So they have an interest in everything that's going on in that basin, including garage door openers. So a bunch of us sat down in a room one day and said, you know, let's just suppose that we have a question. Let's ask this question. What would it take to keep flows in this river from being diminished by groundwater pumping over time? How much would we actually have to recharge next to this river to keep it alive at today's levels? Today meaning 2003, a long time ago now. But we were basically saying, if we're okay with the way things are today, what would it take going into the future, even though pumping is going to increase, you know, how much water would it really take to fix this problem? Because we know the river is going to be impacted by pumping. And this was back in a time where everybody was thinking about recharging here. Okay, this is the Cono Depression, this is where pumping wells are, and everybody thought, well, we can just recharge our effluent here and hope for the best at the river. We said, well, wait a minute, maybe we ought to consider the fact that this is a long way from the river. It's going to take decades, if not centuries, for these effects to propagate there. And plus, they're going to get sucked up by the pumping wells anyway. So what about actually taking the recharge close to the river? What would that do? And so we ran some simulations for these three sites, 2 on the main stem of the San Pedro, 1 on the main tributary, the Baba Camari. There's the purpose of the study. And starting with the Baba was a special case because there's actually no flow in the Baba. It's an ephemeral or intermittent system. But there is a riparian corridor in places. So that means there's trees that are accessing groundwater there. And it was important to say, you know, if we can't have flow, let's at least maintain groundwater levels in a place where trees can access them. So that's why I wanted to go into that ET example, because I want you to understand that in the ET zone here, that's where plants can access water. But if groundwater drops below that, as it's simulated here, the trees are toast, starting at about 2015, all right? I mean, they can't get to it anymore. So to keep the corridor, the riparian corridor alive, we would want to maintain water levels like this. That's a long way apart. This is in feet on this side. So we're talking about, you know, 30 feet of difference here from what's actually projected to happen in the future if nothing is done. So this was a goal to maintain this water level in the groundwater system under the Baba Camari. How much would it take and when? So we tried 500 acre-feet per year at one site, and this was the result. Well, that's a little better, but still, it just pushed the effect out to the mid-2030s. It really didn't address the problem after that. And after that, we realized that we had to keep adding more and more and more water over time. We couldn't just put in a constant rate and hope that it was going to work. It was only going to push the problem out so far. But we did find out that using a variable rate of recharge and distributing it out in time could solve the problem. So here's the head that we were trying to maintain. That was the simulated head with this recharge distribution. So what we learned here was that we could start with these, I'm sorry, these are in cubic meters. I think it's, yeah, cubic meters per year. So it's not a meaningful unit to you, but could start with like a couple 100 acre feet in the early 2000s and step it up every decade or so, gradually over time, to the point where we're able to sustain this depth to water for 100 years. And that's important to know, that you don't have to have the whole problem fixed today, but you have to keep up with the damage that's being done by the Kona depression that's eating into this system. So as the impacts of pumping are spreading out, we have to compensate by adding more recharge over time. And this problem says, you don't need a huge amount of increase each year, but you do need to keep increasing it over time. Yeah. Yes. So this is a transient model based on increased population and pumping over time. And so we did that for the other two sites as well, and what we found out was that the sites on the main stem of the San Pedro really required very little additional water over time. I mean, very little compared to the Babo. 500 to 600 acre feet at Garden Canyon in the middle, and way down in Palominas, about 700 acre feet, was enough to keep those systems from diminishing over time based on the simulated conditions. And this was a big turning point in people's thinking in this basin. Was, okay, we're pumping out somewhere on the order of 10,000 acre feet per year, but we could get by with something on the order of 3,800 acre feet per year. I don't know if I have that on here. No. Well, yeah, next slide. But, I mean, we're talking about a small fraction. 3,000 to 4,000 acre feet per year could solve a problem of a 10,000 acre foot extraction. So you don't have to, completely compensate for all the pumping if you can put the recharge in the right place at the right time. And we also found out through scenarios that we could save water by simultaneously recharging at all three sites, rather than doing one side or the other. So the two on the main stem of the San Pedro, they feed on each other, of course. If you simulate upstream, the downstream side's going to benefit and require less water. So there's some savings to be made by doing both those sites together. And then below the Babo, of course, having recharge on the Babo helps. So there was some synergy there. But overall, we found this number of 3,800 acre feet to be 100 years out. That was the number we were looking at. Much closer to the present, we're looking at only 1,500 acre feet. So it became a problem that sounded somewhat manageable. Instead of saying, we need to just stop pumping, or we need to replace 10,000 acre feet a year in the Kona depression, that wasn't going to happen. But 3,000 acre feet a year is on the order of what they're recharging at the effluent treatment plant now, and it seemed like some kind of a manageable prospect for recharge in the future, even though they didn't know where they're going to get the water yet. But it was something to shoot for. All right, Clarkdale, Arizona is in the Middle Verde. You probably all know where that is, but small, very small little town with about 2,000 permanent residents. And they have, amazingly, grade A+ effluent that they produce and don't know what to do with. They have, like you, a permitting restriction. Their permit says you're only allowed to spray your effluent all over the surface of the earth and see what happens with it. Do whatever you want on the surface, but you're not allowed to do anything else with it. So they have a beautiful crop of cottonwood trees growing on a hillside in Clarkdale. It's just getting sprinkled every day with grade A+ effluent. It's very pretty, but no one walks over there, nobody does anything with it, and it's basically going into the atmosphere. So there was a question, what is the best use of this effluent? Maybe we could achieve our goals as a community by doing something other than spraying all our effluent in the air. So we took it upon ourselves to explore this problem with groundwater modeling. And the options were basically, we want to stop spraying it. I mean, they kind of understood that part, but do we want to either reuse the effluent directly or recharge it maybe close to the river? And this is a picture of the Verde River, which is super beautiful in that area. It's not a big river, small river, but right on the border of Clarkdale, and they're very closely attached to it, and their community identity is really wrapped up in the river. So they have some well-articulated and popular community objectives that they had to work with. We're sort of driving their process. And number one is protect the Verde River. And this is a very small community, but guess what? They are pumping groundwater in the alluvium between the mountain front and the river. Just like everybody else in Arizona, they're intercepting flows that could go to the river. So they knew, you know, in their mind, they're like, we're impacting this river that we love so much. What can we do about it? They also realized that municipal wells are at risk. They're mining groundwater. They're eventually going to run out of water in their wells if they just keep pumping. They're going to have to add new wells, move wells around, do something. So they've got to address this issue of their protecting their municipal water supply as well. They want to encourage conservation. They have extremely high water rates for anywhere in Arizona. I think they're the highest. And they want to show people that you can live within your means. They don't encourage swimming pools. And they have water restrictions. At the drop of a hat, they'll employ, you know, level 2 water restrictions, which is a mixed bag. But anyway, that's the ethos of this community. It's very much all about saving water. They did, when they hired me, they had a preconceived notion that pumping-related stream depletions should be mitigated with near-stream managed aquifer recharge, or just recharge. And they saw this happening in the San Pedro, and they thought, we want that. We want an EOP that sustains our stream. That was kind of it. They just assumed they had the solution. But first of all, they didn't know what their impact to the river was. So that's where we started. You know, how much impact can a community of 2,000 people have on this river? And so we simulated it. The red line is simulated pumping from 1960 up to the present, just about in the early, about 2000, and then leveling off because we didn't know what was going to happen in the future. The black line is aquifer storage depletion, and what you see is early days of pumping were almost matched equally by aquifer storage depletion. So when you first turn on a well, all the water that comes out of that well is coming from right around the well in the aquifer. But over time, that storage depletion started changing and going down and was instead replaced with river flow. So basically, this is the part where they start capturing Verde River water and replacing that aquifer storage. So this was their impact, okay? However, if you look at this axis, that's a pretty small number. 0.5 CFS, it's about 0.1% of today's base flow in the river. So it is an impact. I mean, the hydrology is, you know, says they're right about their intuition that they're harming the river, but it's a very small number. So, you know, if you're talking about building a project, a recharge project, I mean, that's a lot of money. And, you know, the question is, for a small community with limited resources, what's really the best way to meet their community objectives? And so that took a bunch of time to kind of sort through their numbers for their community water budget. Basically, we knew they were pumping out about 373 acre-feet per year for demand. Of that, about 132 acre-feet were coming to the treatment plant for treatment. And of that, about 88%, 116 acre-feet, were being evaporated. And that left only about 16 acre-feet for recharge. So 4% of their effluent was being recharged. And to me, I look at this and see this as total available water. They have the water they pump out of the ground, and then they have the water that they don't evaporate before it gets to the treatment plant. So somehow these two together are really their water budget. They could do something with this water besides evaporate it. So they have about 506 acre feet per year to work with. We projected, what I wanted to know was how is influent production going to change over time? Because they have a funny distribution. It's a hill slope community. Some places are sewered. A lot of places aren't sewered. And, you know, they gave me the map of the sewer, and I was like, well, why don't you sewer this place and this place that are kind of new subdivisions, and they built them with septic tanks, and I didn't understand it. And they said, well, it's difficult. It's kind of expensive. I said, could you do it? And they said, well, yeah, we could. And by the way, those septic systems are all approaching replacement period now. So there's some thought about, you know, how this number might change over time and what it would take. But anyway, using the currently sewered system the way it is now, we added in development that we expect for the near term, and then foreseeable development that's not yet planned, and then development far into the future, considering also that that sewers could be added to some of this new development. And we came up with a projection for cumulative demand and cumulative inflow to the treatment plant. So we ran the pumping scenarios. We had sort of a high extreme scenario of the early 2000s when everybody's growth was going gangbusters and Clarkdale was going to be Manhattan next week. Everybody in the Verde Valley was expecting this. And really what happened was this or this. It happened like this for a while, and now we're kind of seeing this happening. You know, but this could happen a bit longer. The growth just came to a standstill. So we simulated 3 different options for future pumping, which then led to a couple different options for future effluent production, and this was sort of with the maximum growth and with projected growth here. And the question really is, you know, what if effluent recharge could be increased from a measly 4% today to 30 or even 60% of total demand? So that means whatever people are wanting to get at their house, they're actually putting more than half of it back in the sewers, and that more than half is actually going into the ground and not being evaporated or lost along the way. Okay, so here are some simulations. This is the north end of Clarkdale. It's a very long, skinny community, kind of like Kingman, I guess. They have a few wells, existing wells in these spots here. This one here is abandoned. This is a production well, and this is a production well, and this is a production well. This is where they spray their effluent right now. Here's the treatment plant. Here's the Verde River. So the treatment plant's kind of right on the Verde River, but they pipe it over to here. They have a storage tank. And this is the nice little hill slope of about, I think it's 50 or 60 acres where they spray cottonwood trees. So the question then that we wanted to answer with the simulations is, what if we recharge at either this abandoned well or right next to where we've got a storage tank and plumbing already, which is kind of close to the Verde River. So we put recharge cells in there and simulated recharge and monitored heads in all these other places, in these other important places that we're still pumping, by the way. Those are the head observation points. And here's what we saw. These 2 wells on the right, water level plots, are for the recharge, in the one abandoned well. And this is at the site down by the Bitter Creek spray irrigation site. And so you can see the different effluent scenarios. We had different combinations and rates of effluent, but the best case scenario was high effluent recharge in the well, in this well. That produced the greatest impact to heads, a 56-meter increase over baseline by 2075. And at the recharge site down by Bitter Creek, if we move the recharge from here to here, we saw a 16-meter increase here. Why was it less? Well, different hydrologic conditions. less tight formation, it's more shallow alluvium, and losing some of it to the river. These wells over here were pretty much not impacted a whole lot by recharge in either site. Recharging in the abandoned well had the biggest impact on both the other wells. All right, so what was the actual maximum impact on the river? Here's the model. You can see this grid is refined in the area of Clarkdale and then coarser kind of around in other areas. This blue line is the Verde River flowing in this direction, Oak Creek coming in here. And so I put in two observations, one here and one here, to kind of see what the impact of these two recharge sites was on the river. And taking a look here, the maximum impact came from the scenario where we put maximum effluent into the Bitter Creek site down closer to the river. And that maximum impact at 2075 was 0.4 CFS of change in flow in the river. Here, farther down, same scenario produced the biggest result and about the same amount of flow change. So this is compared with no effluent recharge. These are compared with baseline. So the best case scenario was an additional 0.7% of current base flow. Right now, I don't know if you remember, but their depletion is predicted to be 0.1% of current base flow. So this would be above and beyond, making up for their impacts to the river by 2075. But it's still a very small number. So then people started saying, well, is it really worth it? Okay, it's going to help. If you have a river that's 50 CFS and you add 0.7 CFS, is that going to, or 0.4 CFS, who's ever going to know? It's really not a measurable change. So is it worth it? And in the end, they kind of rethought the whole thing and said, really what we want to do is reduce this consumptive use term. We want people to stop watering grass. We actually don't want to water our town park grass and waste all that, to ET with, from our wells. What we really want to do is reduce consumptive use and improve the amount of water, increase the amount of water in our budget. And reuse may meet the objectives that we have better than recharge would. So reuse would mean plumbing their effluent back uphill to their city park, for example, instead of spraying it on trees or recharging it near the river. They would keep it in town. And what that would do is reduce the amount of pumping out of their municipal wells. So it would also protect their municipal well field by not having to pump hundreds of acre feet a year just to put on grass at the park. So this is one case where the process of going through and developing the scenarios and running the model and all this long process that took a couple of years kind of turned the whole wagon in a different direction. And, it's not, to me, it was not a disappointment at all. It was a very happy outcome that this was something that they had a clear answer to their question that they went in with. And it wasn't the answer they expected, but it was an answer. Yes?
So they were just offsetting the municipal use, there weren't any other potential reclaimed water use?
Oh, there could be, yeah. Yeah, they're actually looking at agricultural uses. They're talking about, and I haven't been involved for a couple of years, so they might have done this already, but they were negotiating with vineyards and talking about using some effluent, which is already plumbed to that site at Bitter Creek. Instead of growing cottonwoods, they would grow grapes. And so they would actually make money for the town and reuse the effluent, but not have any additional impact on their municipal system. So that's one possibility. I mean, so there are multiple objectives, as you know, for a city. I mean, you got to make money somehow. You got to support your infrastructure, maintenance, and improvements. But you also have to take care of them and satisfy your community ethos of conservation. And, they want to be a showcase for what a community can do it right. Okay, I think this is where I sit down and let the other guys take over and